The first scream was not hers. It came from the storm outside, wind clawing against the shutters of the old stone manor, as though the night itself had found its voice and wanted to warn her. But warnings came too late. By the time the candle flames began to gutter, the young bride was already lying still in her wedding dress, lips pale, skin cooling against the oak table. A doctor stood over her, trembling not with grief, but with awe. He believed he had just found a way to defy death itself. What price would you pay to never grow old? Dr. Nathaniel Harrow was born in the late 19th century, but he never truly belonged to it. Those who remembered him in his youth described a strange boy with eyes too sharp for his age, who dissected frogs in the schoolyard while the others played ball. He carried the smell of chemicals in his clothes and the relentless rhythm of ambition in his voice. By the time he reached Harvard in the first years of the new century, he had already chosen his enemy, mortality itself. Time, he told a crowded lecture hall in 1906, is the one illness we have not yet conquered, but it is only an illness, and all illnesses yield to science in the end. His words were delivered with the conviction of Scripture, and for some students they were exhilarating. For others, they were chilling. Harrow was 33 then, a physician by training, an anatomist by obsession. His papers hinted at daring possibilities: cellular regeneration, tissue preservation, experimental grafting, but they were dismissed as speculative, even dangerous. Yet his confidence never wavered. He had the kind of smile that could pass for reassurance while hiding a darker certainty. He did not intend to die like other men. By 1912, he had secured a private estate north of Boston. The locals called it the Stone House, a Georgian manor whose chimneys leaned against the sky like the arms of a skeleton. Visitors who dared step inside noticed three things immediately. The air carried the acrid tang of formaldehyde, sharp enough to sting the nose. The halls echoed with a constant low hum from gas lamps, buzzing like a swarm of trapped insects. And the floorboards, worn to a waxy smoothness, seemed to betray decades of restless pacing. Guests left uneasy, and most did not return. But one young woman did. Her name was Eleanor Whitcomb. She was not merely beautiful, though Harrow often described her that way in his letters. She was also clever, a botanist trained in the delicate science of plant grafting. She understood how one living stem could be split, joined, and made to thrive upon another. It was a knowledge that fascinated Harrow, and in her he saw not only a companion, but a collaborator. They married on May 14th, 1914, under a tent pitched against the threat of rain. The storm rolled in all the same. Neighbors gathered in their best dresses and suits, whispering beneath parasols. "She's marrying her professor," one muttered. "He's twice her age and twice as strange." The thunder that shook the valley that day was remembered for years, as though the sky itself had objections to the union. By midsummer, Eleanor fell ill. Typhoid fever came in waves, chills, rashes, and nights of delirium that left her clutching at her husband's sleeve. Harrow, the physician, prescribed rest, broths, tinctures, but the man inside him seethed. In his private journal he wrote, July 8th, 1914, "The body betrays the soul. If I can perfect her, I can perfect us. The fault is not love. It is the meat we carry it in." Eleanor died 3 weeks later. Ordinary men would have collapsed under grief. Harrow did not. He saw in her death a cruel confirmation of his life's mission. He vowed to bring her back, not symbolically, not spiritually, but literally. That vow turned the Stone House into a laboratory of horrors. Neighbors soon noticed the odd shipments. Wooden crates unloaded under cover of night, labeled scientific instruments, but heavy enough to require 2 men to drag across the lawn. They noticed the lanterns burning past midnight, shadows moving in the windows when no guests were expected. They whispered, shook their heads, and walked away. What would you have done? Knocked on his door? Reported your suspicions? Or like them, would you have turned a blind eye and told yourself it was none of your concern? Inside those shuttered rooms, Harrow began his work. Using preserved tissues, preserved blood samples, and the grafting principles Eleanor herself once studied, he attempted something he called reiteration. His theory was simple, at least on paper. If one could replicate the body, stitch together memory with flesh, the soul would return to inhabit its rightful vessel. The first attempt lived less than an hour, twitching spasms that ended in silence. The second breathed for 2 days before collapsing. By the third, Harrow swore he saw recognition in her eyes, however fleeting. Each attempt was more convincing, more lifelike. And yet, something was always wrong. Their skin had an uncanny pallor. Their voices faltered at unexpected moments. Their movements were stiff, like actors reciting roles they didn't understand. Harrow called it corrupted iteration. He kept each failed bride locked in the cellar, unwilling to destroy them, promising himself he would fix the errors in the next version. 7 attempts in total. 7 brides stitched from love and terror. The 7th was different. She awakened in the autumn of 1919, when the Massachusetts trees burned gold and crimson, and the marshes around the stone house steamed with mist. Villagers noticed Harrow's carriage flying through town at odd hours that season, its lanterns blazing well past midnight, as though he were racing some unseen rival. He told no one that in his cellar, Eleanor Seventh sat upright, lips moving. Her first sentence was not, "I love you." It was, "Where are they?" The cellar had grown crowded. Her sisters slumped in corners, silent and still, preserved but not destroyed. Their glassy eyes reflected the lantern light like an audience awaiting judgment. Eleanor Seventh studied them, then studied him, and something in her face shifted into fury, or perhaps grief. That night, Harrow wrote his final entry. October 2nd, 1919. She does not obey. She remembers, or worse, she imagines. Must correct tomorrow, but tomorrow never came. Because on the stroke of midnight, the 7th bride rose from the table, took her maker's trembling hand, and led him toward the cellar where her sisters waited. 7 against 1. And in that moment, Dr. Nathaniel Harrow realized he had not built eternity. He had built his grave, eternal love, eternal horror. The storm passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder. By dawn, the stone house stood like a mausoleum at the edge of the Boston marsh, its chimneys still smoking, its shutters clamped tight as eyelids refusing to open. Inside, the air smelled of iron and vinegar, sharp and metallic, as if the house itself had been bled. The walls carried dampness that seeped into clothes and skin, and the floors creaked like groaning voices whenever a step fell too hard. What happens to a community when whispers grow louder than facts? In the autumn of 1919, neighbors noticed something uncanny. The once busy estate grew quiet. The gates remained chained. Deliveries of coal and lamp oil tripled, though no servants were ever seen. At night, faint light flickered through the cellar windows, glowing like a pulse beneath the ground. The villagers of Ipswich avoided the road past Harrow's estate. Mothers told children not to play near the property. Even the parish priest, Father Connolly, admitted privately that he would rather walk 3 miles longer than take the shortcut past the stone house. And yet, no one intervened, no one knocked. They said, "It's not our place." They said, "The doctor has his experiments." They said, "He pays his debts and minds his own." Would you? Would you risk your family's peace to confront what you only half suspected? The legend says that by October 23rd, Harrow had vanished. His servants, few as they were, drifted away without explanation. The stone house windows grew dark, and the villagers finally gathered the courage to act. Sheriff Elias Warren rode up the gravel drive with 2 deputies, their horses snorting clouds into the frosted morning air. They entered through the front, the heavy brass knocker still cold from the night. Inside, the silence was not empty but waiting. The smell struck them first, rot layered over chemicals, like spoiled meat hidden under camphor. Their boots left prints in dust thick enough to choke, though in certain places, the floorboards gleamed as though scrubbed clean. Warren carried a lantern. Its glow revealed details too unsettling to dismiss as eccentric science. Tables stacked with vials of cloudy liquid, chalk diagrams scrawled across walls, sketches of hearts, lungs, and faces repeating in endless circles. And in the library, a row of wedding veils folded neatly beside medical instruments, as though the doctor had catalogued romance and anatomy in the same breath. The deeper they searched, the more the manor transformed into a stage set for obsession. One deputy reported the faint sound of dripping water. Another swore he heard movement behind a locked door. When they finally broke the cellar padlock, the lantern light fell into a world none of them would forget. The cellar walls dripped with moisture, a cold that slid into bones. Wooden beams overhead groaned under their own weight, and the floor was littered with broken glass and dark stains. Against the far wall stood 6 figures in various states of collapse. 6 women in dresses, their faces pale, their hair brittle, their hands folded unnaturally stiff. The deputies recoiled. "Mannequins," one muttered, voice trembling. But Sheriff Warren shook his head. He leaned closer, lantern trembling in his grip. The glassy eyes stared back, catching the flame. And in the stillness, one of them, just one, shifted slightly, as if adjusting to the light. "Jesus," whispered Warren. 6 brides, silent, preserved. And where was the 7th? A journal lay open on a nearby table, its ink smeared but legible. In Harrow's careful hand, October 1st, success nearly complete. She speaks. She remembers fragments. Tomorrow I correct the remainder. October 2nd, resistance she will not obey. She speaks of the others. Correction postponed. October 3rd, no entry. The sheriff slammed the book shut. His men refused to stay another hour, and the law was not yet ready to name what they had seen. So the cellar door was sealed again, the house locked, and Harrow was declared missing. Officially, no record survives of the preserved women. Unofficially, locals began crossing themselves whenever the subject arose. But here is the question that still lingers. If Harrow was gone, who closed the cellar door behind them? By 1922, the stone house was sold at auction to a shipping magnate who used it only in summers. He complained of drafts, of flickering gas lamps, of the sensation that someone watched him while he read. Servants left abruptly, citing smells from the basement. Twice guests reported hearing a woman's voice in the night whispering, "Where are they?" Time passed, but the memory of Harrow's obsession refused to fade. His notebooks, salvaged piecemeal, circulated through medical circles. Some hailed him as a visionary decades ahead of his time. speculating on cellular renewal and organ transplantation. Others condemned his methods as butchery dressed as science. And yet, fragments of his research reappeared in journals as late as 1930, unattributed but suspiciously familiar. Even today, a faded entry remains in the Ipswich Historical Register, dated October 27, 1919. Report filed by Sheriff Elias Warren, entered Stonehouse by order of county, found evidence of unusual anatomical experimentation, possible preservation attempts, no sign of Dr. Harrow. Premises secured, further inquiry recommended. The recommendation was never followed. The sheriff retired the next spring. His deputies refused to discuss the cellar again. But what about the seventh bride? The villagers told themselves she must have perished, her body hidden alongside her sister's. Yet strange sightings soon festered into rumor. A woman in a wedding veil walking the marsh road at dusk. Footsteps echoing on gravel, though no one appeared. In 1925, a fisherman swore he pulled his nets near the estuary and saw a pale figure watching him from the reeds, her hand raised as if in greeting or warning. The legend grew. The stone house earned a reputation not only for its drafts and its rot, but for its inhabitant who had never left. The bride who wouldn't die. By the time the Great Depression settled over Massachusetts, children dared each other to run up the drive and touch the brass knocker before fleeing. Some said they heard knocking in return. Others said they felt cold fingers brush their wrists. One boy claimed he heard laughter echoing through the chimney, though the house had long been abandoned. Was it Eleanor Seventh? Was it Harrow himself, trapped by the very corpses he created? Or was it something else? Something born not from science, but from the despair of trying to cage eternity. The stone house still stands, and its windows are not as empty as they seem. It began with a cough, not the shallow rattle of illness, but the sharp inhale of someone startled awake. Down in the stonehouse cellar, beneath dripping beams and rows of preserved sisters, the seventh bride stirred. Her skin was warmer than theirs. Her lips trembled as if forming words, and though her chest rose unevenly, she was undeniably alive. What would you do if you opened your eyes and found yourself among 6 corpses wearing your face? Dr. Nathaniel Harrow did not pause to ask. He stood above her, notebook in hand, recording every twitch, every blink, as though cataloging the rebirth of a saint. But even saints resist. Her first memory was of light. Lantern glow against damp walls, trembling in the reflection of glass jars that lined the shelves. The jars contained things she could not yet name, pale fragments floating in yellow liquid, labels scrawled in Harrow's looping script, heart, lung, hand, each word pressed like a brand into her forming consciousness. And then, faces, 6 of them, slumped in corners, their features sagging but unmistakable. They were her. She was them. The seventh bride whispered, "Where are they?" Harrow froze. This was not the compliant question he had prepared for. He had hoped she would ask for him, for her husband. Instead, her first thought leapt toward the others, the sisters. He tried to soothe her, calling her Eleanor, repeating their wedding vows like a lullaby. She flinched, shrinking back against the cold stone wall. In her body, a strange duality bloomed. Fragments of memory she could not own, overlapping with instincts too sharp to deny. The smell of roses at a graveside, the chill of water closing over her lungs, the scrape of metal instruments against skin. These belonged to them, the 6 iterations before her, but she felt them as if carved into her own nerves. By dawn, Harrow was convinced he could erase the fragments. He spoke of correction, of procedure, of excising the errors. He wheeled out trays of tools polished to a surgical gleam. But each time he approached, she recoiled. Each time he touched her, she pulled away. Resistance was new. Resistance was unacceptable. In his journals he wrote, October 4th, 1919, subject refuses compliance. Demonstrates memory beyond design. Possible shared consciousness? Must isolate and observe. Isolation meant chains. Rusted cuffs snapped around her wrists, bolting her to an iron bed frame in the corner of the cellar. She did not scream. She studied him instead, eyes calculating. Days passed. He brought broth laced with tonics, whispering of devotion. She sipped only enough to stay alive. At night he read poetry aloud, convinced beauty could bind her to him. She listened, silent, the words etching themselves into her memory alongside the jars, the diagrams, the smell of death. But when he left, when the cellar door groaned shut, she spoke to the others. Not aloud, but in murmurs too soft for human ears. Patience, she called one. Grace, she named another. The names came unbidden, rising from depths she could not explain. Whether they were truly her sister's names or imagined fragments, she did not know. But she believed them, and belief can turn whispers into resolve. What if grief itself could resurrect the dead? The more she whispered, the more the cellar seemed to change. Shadows lengthened unnaturally. Drafts of cold air moved against the natural current, and sometimes, just before sleep, she swore one of the six shifted an arm, tilted ahead, leaned ever so slightly closer. By the second week of October, Harrow's control faltered. Exhaustion etched lines into his face. He was terrified not of her rebellion, but of his own obsession slipping from his grasp. He had built 6 corpses, sacrificed years of research, risked discovery, all for this single moment. And now the creation he wanted to worship him stared at him with the eyes of the condemned. Neighbors noticed his decline. In the village, he appeared less often, his clothes wrinkled, his hair unkempt. He muttered to himself while buying supplies: ether, chloroform, carbolic acid. A shopkeeper later recalled, "He looked like a man already buried, walking on borrowed time, yet no one asked questions. No one intervened. Would you have?" On the night of October 12th, something shifted permanently. The sheriff's records later suggested a storm had struck that evening, the marsh swollen with rain. Inside the stone house, lanterns guttered. In the cellar, chains rattled against stone, but not from struggle. The 7th bride had stopped resisting. She sat upright, eyes calm, voice steady. "Show me," she said. Harrow blinked. "Show you what?" "Show me the others. Teach me." It was the words he had longed to hear, twisted into a shape he could not refuse. He released one shackle, then the other, cautious but hopeful. She did not attack. She rose, barefoot on the damp floor, and walked slowly toward the wall of jars. Her hand hovered over one, tracing the label heart. Then she turned, meeting his gaze. "You think you gave me life," she whispered, "but you only borrowed it." Before he could answer, the cellar shifted. It was not the storm outside, not entirely. It was the weight of 6 slumped bodies straightening, heads lifting, hands twitching, as though remembering purpose. Harrow stumbled backward, disbelief breaking into a scream. They were moving, 6 against 1. He grabbed for instruments, scalpel flashing. The 7th bride caught his wrist, her grip iron. Her eyes burned with something older than memory. "You cannot kill what you already made," she said. And then the sisters rose together. What they did next would never be written in his journals, for Harrow would not live to record it. But when neighbors later crept close to the stone house, they swore they heard a man screaming, followed by 7 voices singing in eerie unison. A hymn, some said. A curse, said others. The cellar swallowed the sound. By dawn, the doctor was gone, but the house was not empty. The 7th bride lingered, seated among her sisters, her voice low, her words deliberate. She spoke not only for them, but for every iteration that had come before. Her question now was no longer, where are they? Her question was, what comes next? And somewhere beyond the marsh, beyond the shuttered windows and the locked cellar door, the world continued unaware. But not for long, because the 7th bride had no intention of staying silent. The stone house still held secrets, secrets waiting to walk beyond its gates. Morning broke gray over the marshlands. The air hung damp, heavy with the metallic tang of storm water and something else, something sharper, the copper scent of fresh blood. But in the stone house, silence ruled. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow was gone. No trace remained of him save for a trail of overturned instruments, torn scraps of his coat, and the faintest smear of crimson that vanished into the cracks between cellar stones. Neighbors would later argue whether he had been consumed, buried, or something worse, drawn down into the earth by the very abominations he had created. Yet one fact stood, beyond dispute: the doctor was never seen again. That left the 7th bride, and her sisters. She rose first, breath steady, chains broken and discarded. She moved through the cellar with the surety of someone who had lived there for centuries, though her lungs had only filled with air for a matter of weeks. Around her, the other 6 sat slumped as before, lifeless to the casual eye. But she knew better. Their stillness was only the surface. Beneath, something stirred. She lit a lantern, its glow flickering across their faces. "Wake," she whispered. "All of you. Wake." The words carried weight. Perhaps they were command, perhaps prayer, perhaps simply memory voiced aloud. But the effect was undeniable. One by one, the others shuddered, eyelids fluttered, fingers twitched. And then, in the hush of the cellar, 6 pairs of eyes opened at once. Imagine the horror of watching yourself multiply. Each bride bore her face, her features, yet each carried decay, scars, or unfinished seams from Harrow's cruel work. One had stitches across her jaw that never healed. Another's skin sagged as if time had aged her too fast. Yet in their eyes burned recognition, rage, grief, and hunger. The 7th bride stepped closer, unafraid. "We are not his anymore," she said. "Then whose are we?" asked the one with the stitched jaw, her voice like paper tearing. "Each other's," came the answer. The words cemented something among them, a bond neither natural nor holy. They were sisters now, not by blood, but by design, by death, and by rebellion. Above, the storm's damage had left the stone house isolated. Fallen trees blocked the road. The marsh swelled, flooding pathways. For days no one approached, believing the doctor was tending to his mysterious experiments. That suited the brides. They needed time. The 7th bride, though she now despised the title bride, for it bound them to a man who no longer breathed, took leadership without question. She moved through Harrow's study, reading his journals by candlelight, absorbing every page of his obsessive scrawl. The words filled her with fury. Subject 3, terminated prematurely due to lung collapse. Subject 4, evidence of consciousness transfer incomplete. Subject 6. Possible contamination of soul residue. They had been notes to him, experiments, failures. Yet each failure had bled into her veins, gifting her the fragments of memory that made her more than a shell. She realized she was not singular. She was the sum. All 7 lived in her, even before they rose. And now, they all wanted something Harrow had never considered. Freedom. But freedom demanded choice. "Do we remain?" asked one sister, her skin pale as wax, her eyes unblinking. "This house reeks of him. His shadow lingers." "Where would we go?" another countered. "The world is not made for creatures like us. We are neither bride nor widow, neither alive nor dead." They turned to their tutorous leader. The 7th bride, who by then had begun calling herself Clara, borrowing a name from one of the memories lodged in her marrow, considered. She thought of the marsh, the village beyond, the church bells she faintly remembered, though she had never truly heard them. Could they walk into such a world? Would anyone accept 7 women wearing the same face, carrying the stink of grave dirt and ether? No. The world would hunt them. But perhaps the world could also fear them. Clara tested her power first. At night she stood at the window, whispering to the marshes. The reeds bent unnaturally in answer. Frogs fell silent. Owls refused to hoot. When she closed her eyes, she saw visions of the doctor screaming, of blood sinking into soil, of roots clutching his remains. The land itself had swallowed him, she realized, drawn by their whispered hymn. It was not just they who had risen. Something older had awakened with them. "Then we are not bound," Clara told her sisters. "We are chosen." The word chosen lit a fire in their hollowed chests. Chosen meant purpose. Chosen meant survival. And so, in the weeks that followed, the stone house became not a prison, but a sanctuary. The sisters cleaned the cellar, burying broken instruments in shallow graves. They burned Harrow's remaining tonics, their acrid smoke curling into the rafters. They sewed clothing from sheets, dressing themselves not as brides, but as widows of a man they had collectively murdered. Clara marked each of them with a symbol, a thin red thread tied around the wrist, knotted 7 times. A tether, a reminder. 7 for 1, she said. Always. The village began to notice. Children playing near the marsh swore they saw lanterns in the stone house long after midnight. Hunters claimed their hounds refused to near its gates, whining as if scenting rot. The church minister, uneasy, remarked that the marsh had grown unnaturally quiet, as though the very wildlife avoided it. Still, no one dared visit. Not yet. It was Martha Washington, widow of the village blacksmith, who first grew suspicious. She remembered Clara's face, though she could not name it. The doctor had once paraded his brides in town, fleeting glimpses of pale women who vanished as quickly as they arrived. And now the widow swore she saw that same face at the upstairs window, staring out with a look not of longing, but of judgment. Rumors spread. The doctor is dead. The brides live on. They walk the house by candlelight. Each whisper seeded fear, and fear gave the sisters power. But power attracts danger. One October night, a group of men armed with lanterns and rifles gathered at the marsh edge. They claimed it was their Christian duty to burn the house, to purge whatever devilry lingered. The 7th bride, Clara, watched them from the upstairs window as her sisters huddled around her. "They will kill us," said one. "They cannot," Clara answered, "because they believe we are monsters, and monsters cannot die by mortal hands." When the men crossed the marsh, their boots sucking in the mud. The lanterns flickered and died. Their rifles misfired. The reeds whispered like voices. One man swore he felt cold fingers dragging him into the muck, though no one stood beside him. By dawn, only half the men returned. The others were never found. The village never tried again. From then on, the stone house stood abandoned by all but its residents. The brides rarely ventured beyond its gates. They did not need to. Villagers left offerings at the marsh edge, bread, salt, sometimes even trinkets of gold, hoping to appease the women within. The sisters accepted these silently, never revealing themselves, though Clara sometimes whispered gratitude carried on the wind. Over time, they became legend. Children called them the 7 widows of the marsh. Hunters swore their game disappeared near the property, stolen by unseen hands. And on storm nights, travelers claimed they heard singing carried through the rain, 7 voices rising in unholy harmony. The stone house had become a tomb for Harrow, but for his brides, it had become something far stranger, a kingdom. And Clara, the 7th who was first to awaken, ruled as its queen. But even queens cannot silence curiosity forever. One day, the outside world would return, and when it did, the sisters would be ready. Because monsters, once born, do not fade. They wait. The year was 1871, late autumn, when the marsh grasses turned copper and the air reeked of wood smoke. The stone house stood silent behind its wrought iron gate, its shutters closed, its chimneys long cold. To the villagers, it was no longer a home, but a warning. Children dared one another to creep near the gate and touch its rusted bars. Lovers whispered promises not to walk past it at night. Farmers swore that when they plowed too close, their oxen balked, eyes rolling white. And yet one man ignored the warnings. His name was Elias Harrow, brother to the doctor. He arrived one gray morning by carriage, the wheels crunching frozen leaves, the smell of horse sweat thick in the air. He wore the black coat of a city physician, and his boots were polished as though he meant to impress. When he stepped out onto the gravel path, villagers watched from a distance, whispering. Why had he come? To inherit? To investigate? To pry open wounds better left sealed? The truth was simpler. He came for blood. Elias had read the letters, the journals, the fractured notes his brother once mailed in fevered excitement. He knew of the experiments, the brides, the obsession with eternal youth. And where others saw sin, Elias saw opportunity. Immortality, he murmured, running his hand across the rusted gate. If Nathaniel failed, I shall succeed. The gate creaked open without resistance, almost as if it welcomed him. Inside, the house smelled of dust and damp wood. Rats scuttled across floorboards. But beneath the natural rot was another odor, sweet, cloying, unmistakably human. Elias inhaled deeply, eyes glittering. He was not alone. At the top of the staircase stood a woman in black. Her gown hung plain, her hair loose about her shoulders. In the half-light, her face was pale and unblemished, her eyes dark and unwavering. "Dr. Harrow," she said. Her voice was steady, not a question but a recognition. "You know me?" he asked. "You wear his face, but your eyes—" She tilted her head. "Your eyes are hungrier." Elias smiled. "Then you know why I am here." The woman, Clara the 7th, descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. Shadows clung to her as if reluctant to let her go. "Leave," she said. "This house is not yours." But it was his, and now he is gone. Elias gestured broadly. "That makes it mine by right. And you, my dear, are his legacy. You belong to me." The words hung like frost in the air. Clara did not flinch. She merely raised her hand. And from the shadows of the hall, 6 figures emerged, her sisters. Each bore the same face, yet marked differently. Stitched jaw, hollow eyes, skin mottled, lips split. They stood in silence, watching Elias with expressions carved from stone. The doctor's smile faltered, just slightly. "So it's true," he whispered. 7 of you." 7 for 1, Clara said softly. Elias did not retreat. Instead, he drew from his coat a leather-bound book, Nathaniel's final journal, recovered from the wreckage of his laboratory. He flipped it open with manic pride. "Do you know what he achieved?" he demanded. "Not failure, no. Progress. Each of you is a refinement, each closer to perfection. He only lacked discipline, restraint." He pressed his palm to the pages. "But I will continue. I will finish what he began." The sisters stirred uneasily. One hissed under her breath. Another's fingers twitched as if remembering shackles. Clara stepped forward until she was within arm's reach, her eyes fixed on the journal. "You would chain us again," she said. "Not chain," Elias corrected. "Exalt. Through you, mankind shall conquer death itself. Do you not want to live forever?" Here the house seemed to lean inward, listening. Floorboards groaned. The lanterns flickered, though no wind stirred. Clara felt the presence of the marsh pressing at the windows, as if waiting for her word. "Forever?" she repeated. Elias nodded eagerly. "Yes, through me, through science. You will never wither. You will never rot. You will never be forgotten." The stitched jaw sister whispered, "We already do not rot." Another murmured, "We were forgotten long ago." And Clara smiled, a slow curl of lips that made Elias step back. "You misunderstand," she said. "Forever is not a gift. It is a curse, and we do not want it. Not with you." The doctor's face twisted with rage. He snapped the journal shut and lunged, seizing Clara's wrist. His grip was iron, his breath sour with desperation. "You will obey me," he hissed, "as you obeyed him." For a heartbeat, silence, even the rats stilled. Then 6 hands closed around his arms, his shoulders, his throat. Cold fingers, strong as iron clamps, dragged him backward. Elias roared, struggling, but the sisters' strength was unnatural, their unity absolute. "What are you doing?" he choked. "You need me." Clara bent close, her lips brushing his ear. "We needed no man then. We need none now." They dragged him down the cellar stairs. His boots struck wood, his journal falling forgotten on the landing. The air grew damp, rank with earth. Lantern light flickered across the stone table where Nathaniel once cut and stitched. Elias thrashed, spitting curses. "You fools! You'll doom yourselves. Without me, you are nothing." "Without you," Clara interrupted, "we are free." They pressed him onto the table, ropes coiling like serpents around his limbs. He screamed until his throat tore. But no villagers came. They had learned to ignore the cries that seeped from the stone house. And that is perhaps the most chilling truth of all. They heard him. They chose silence. "What would you have done?" The cellar door slammed shut. His cries dwindled. No one in the village ever saw Elias Harrow again. But the marsh did. On storm nights, hunters swore they glimpsed his pale figure stumbling among the reeds, mouth open in a scream that made no sound. Others claimed his shadow still roamed the house, clutching an invisible book, seeking a bride who would not come. The stone house had claimed its second Harrow, and this time, the sisters learned something vital. They were not only survivors, they were executioners, and executioners always crave more. A cold mist clung to the marsh on the morning after Elias Harrow vanished. The villagers rose before dawn, as always, to tend livestock and light their stoves, but whispers began before the sun had fully risen. His carriage still sat at the edge of the lane, horses restless, eyes rolling, steam rising from their flanks. No doctor, no luggage, no sign of departure. The absence itself was evidence. By noon, word had traveled down every muddy road in the county. Another Harrow gone to the stone house, another man devoured by its secrets. Some swore they heard muffled cries the night before, cut short like a door slamming on a hymn. Others claimed to see candlelight flickering in windows long dark. And yet, when the sheriff arrived with his deputies at dusk, the house stood mute and indifferent, its shutters nailed, its doors locked, its rooms choked with dust. No intruder, no blood, no sign that Elias Harrow had ever crossed its threshold. Inside, however, a different harvest had begun. Clara and her sisters sat at the long dining table where once Nathaniel held his grotesque suppers. The table bore no food now, only the doctor's journal laid, open, its pages illuminated by a single oil lamp. The stitched jaw sister traced her finger along the cramped notes, the diagrams of bone structures, the chemical formulas scrawled in fading ink. She did not weep. She did not tremble. "Every page is his," she murmured. "But every page is also ours." Clara nodded. "Knowledge is a weapon. He forged it against us. We shall turn it back." The sisters began to study. By candlelight, by lamplight, by the faint silver glow of the moon, they read the forbidden words that had shaped their prison. They learned of tinctures, of powders, of herbs boiled down to lethal clarity. They read about poisons that paralyzed without killing, about compounds that preserved flesh, about the delicate balances of fire and blood. Clara spoke aloud the words Nathaniel had written in his final hand. The key to eternity lies not in the soul, but in the vessel that contains it. For him, the vessel had always been a woman. For them, the vessel would be vengeance. Seasons turned. The marsh grew lush, then brittle, then froze under a crust of winter ice. Through it all, the sisters worked in silence, perfecting their arts, testing herbs on stray animals, refining recipes of preservation and decay. When spring returned, the villagers noticed something unsettling. Stray dogs vanished. Livestock sometimes went missing. Children whispered of shapes moving by the riverbank at night, 7 shadows where none should be. Still, no one dared confront the stone house. It was easier to look away. And so the silence enabled the horror. The first to feel their harvest was Reverend Powell, the parish priest. He had preached for decades against the Harrow family, condemning their experiments as witchcraft. But when Nathaniel's estate fell vacant, he was quick to claim its land for the church. On a humid night in June, his lantern light bobbed across the marsh as he made his way to survey the property. He never returned. Days later, a fisherman found his Bible washed up along the riverbank, its pages waterlogged, its cover torn. Inside, scrawled in an unfamiliar hand, were words that chilled him to the bone. Preach no more. The disappearances continued, slow but steady. A miller who once delivered flour to the Harrow household. A blacksmith who had sharpened Nathaniel's scalpels. A seamstress who had stitched burial shrouds for too many unnamed women. All gone. And though no bodies were ever found, their absence spoke volumes. The sisters were harvesting not wheat, not corn, but silence itself. Each vanishing erased another who had once turned away, another who had enabled, another who had profited from their pain. The marsh grew fat on secrets, but the sisters themselves were changing too. Clara noticed it first in the mirror. Her reflection seemed sharper, her features more defined, her eyes brighter. She should have aged. After all, years had passed, but she had not. None of them had. The knowledge in Nathaniel's journals, combined with their own grim alchemy, was altering them. They no longer required food in the same way, consuming herbs and tinctures instead of bread. Their skin healed from wounds with unnatural speed. The cold no longer chilled them. Were they becoming what Nathaniel had dreamed of, or something far worse? The stitched jaw sister whispered one night, "If we are not women, what are we?" The question lingered in every room of the stone house. It echoed when they pored over pages, when they crushed herbs into paste, when they wrote their own additions into the margins of Nathaniel's journal. Clara began to wonder if immortality was not a choice, but a contagion, something he had planted in them that now blossomed without his control. Could they ever be free of it? Or was there only freedom to wield it as they chose? By autumn, the villagers no longer passed near the estate at all. Roads that once curved by the stone house now cut wider arcs, detouring through woods even at risk of bandits. Children were warned never to mention the Harrow name. Yet still, rumors swirled. Some claimed the sisters danced by moonlight on the marsh, their shadows too long, their voices weaving in languages never taught. Others whispered that the marsh itself drank blood, fed by sacrifices poured from the old well. But the most chilling rumor of all came from a drunkard in a riverside tavern, who swore he had seen 7 women walking single file across the water itself, their bare feet never sinking. The men laughed at him, but none volunteered to disprove it, and so the harvest grew bloodless yet unyielding. Victims vanished, stories multiplied, fear spread. But behind the closed shutters of the stone house, the sisters were no longer content with survival. They had begun to dream of empire. "What if the marsh is not the end?" one asked. "What if there are more like him, more men who believe they can command eternity?" "Then we shall find them," Clara replied. She closed the journal, now thick with their own annotations, their own scrawled diagrams. She tied it with a leather strap and placed it at the center of the table. "This is no longer his book," she said. "It is ours, and we will write the next chapter in blood." The lamp sputtered. The marsh wind rattled the shutters. The night seemed to lean forward, listening. And in that silence, one thing was certain. The sisters were no longer hiding. They were preparing. The first snow of 1921 fell in brittle flakes, hissing as they struck the black water of the marsh. Villagers huddled by their hearths, whispering the same name, Harrow. But the stone house no longer stood silent. Through the frost-blurred windows, faint light flickered. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney, though no one in the village could recall a delivery of coal. Inside, the sisters prepared for war. The house had become an arsenal of the uncanny. In the parlor where Nathaniel once courted Eleanor, shelves now sagged under jars of dried herbs, phials of tinctures glowing faintly green, and bones carved into ritual shapes. The air smelled of vinegar, smoke, and something metallic, like coins rubbed between damp fingers. The sisters had mapped every room, every secret stairway, every tunnel Nathaniel once used to smuggle his experiments unseen. Clara, who now spoke less like a woman and more like a commander, declared, "We were not made to hide. We were made to endure, and those who profit from our silence will learn endurance has a sharper edge than death. She spread a map of the county across the table. On it were marked not farms or mills, but names, the men and women who had trafficked in Harrow's ambitions, who had delivered bodies, who had stitched silence into the fabric of the town. The sisters' war would not be loud. It would be patient, precise. A bloodless war of disappearance. The first strike came in February 1921. Sheriff Wilkes, who had ignored pleas from wives and mothers when Nathaniel's women vanished, received a summons late at night. He was told by a young boy that a runaway girl had been spotted near the marsh, barefoot in the snow. The sheriff saddled his horse and rode out, lanterns swinging, his breath fogging the air. By dawn, the horse was found grazing near the frozen river. The sheriff's gloves were still looped over the saddle. His body was never recovered. Pinned to the saddle horn was a scrap of parchment with a single letter written in an elegant curling hand. G words spread quickly. Town meetings were called. Ministers thundered in their pulpits. Yet still, no one dared approach the stone house. Fear was a better warden than any sheriff, and while fear grew outside, inside the sisters' transformation accelerated. The stitched jaw sister no longer needed thread. Her flesh had knit closed, smooth as porcelain. Another sister, once weak and coughing, now breathed without effort, her lungs stronger than ever. Their hair grew thick and dark. Their eyes seemed to gleam in firelight. They did not age. Clara kept notes of their changes, writing in margins beside Nathaniel's formulas. But unlike him, she wrote not with the arrogance of a man trying to defy nature, but with the cold clarity of someone documenting a weapon. "What are we becoming?" one asked in the stillness of night. Clara's reply was simple. Something he could never control, but power draws attention. By the spring of 1922, investigators from Boston arrived. 3 men in bowler hats and heavy coats, calling themselves agents of the state. They set up quarters in the inn, interviewed townsfolk, and soon turned their gaze toward the stone house. The villagers told them everything and nothing. The screams, the vanishings, the lights in the marsh. But when pressed to testify, they grew quiet. After all, had they not ignored it all once before? One woman, a baker whose flour had supplied the Harrows for years, whispered as she served bread to the agents, "You should leave them be. The sisters are only taking what was owed." But the men did not listen. On May 15th, 1922, the agents marched to the stone house with warrants in hand. They carried pistols and lanterns, their boots crunching through reeds. The marsh was unseasonably warm, the air heavy with the smell of algae and smoke. They reached the door, knocked, announced their authority. The door opened on its own. Inside, the parlor was empty, but for the journal, resting on the table, its strap unbuckled, its pages spread as though waiting to be read. The first agent leaned down, squinting at the ink. His lips moved silently, tracing words that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. The others peered over his shoulder. The lanterns flickered. When the villagers crept up at dawn, they found the agents' coats neatly folded on the porch, pistols stacked beside them. The men themselves were gone. Only the journal remained, open to a fresh page. Across it, in steady black script, was written, "This land remembers. So do we." By summer, the county had emptied of authority. Officials refused new assignments. Ministers resigned. Merchants moved upriver. The village became a hollow shell of whispers, a place where the Harrow name was spoken only in prayer, and even then, softly. But silence did not satisfy Clara. She had tasted power, and she knew its reach could stretch beyond the marsh. Her sisters began to travel by night, cloaked and hooded, slipping into neighboring towns. They blended with workers, with widows, with the faceless poor. And always, when they disappeared again, someone else vanished with them. A cruel overseer, a corrupt landlord, a man who beat his servants. The disappearances formed a map of their own, stretching outward like veins from the marsh. It was no longer vengeance. It was expansion. Still, Clara remembered her original vow, not simply to strike, but to endure until she found her daughters, the true daughters, not stitched sisters, but flesh of her flesh. Rumors from Ontario still reached her ears. 2 women running a school for colored children, one with a crooked pinky, one with a birthmark behind her ear. Were they hers? Or only phantoms she had clung to through years of horror? Every plan, every disappearance, every war she waged was shadowed by that single question. Would her daughters know her? Would they even want her? By autumn 1922, the stone house had become legend. Travelers refused the marsh road. Maps began to omit the village entirely, and yet the sisters thrived. Their knowledge deepened. Their power grew. They were no longer 7 frightened brides. They were an army. The final entry Clara wrote that year was short. The ink blotched, as though written in haste. October 31st, 1922, we march at winter's end. The world will know us, and it will not forget. The lamplight guttered. The marsh groaned in the dark, and the 7th bride's war had only just begun. 7 against the world. The thaw of 1923 came late. Winter clung stubbornly to the marsh, holding the river in its frozen grip. The villagers who remained, those too poor or too stubborn to leave, spoke of it as a cursed season, when ice trapped screams beneath its glassy surface. Yet by March, the thaw arrived all at once. The ice cracked like a rifle shot, sending floes tumbling downriver. The current surged, carrying branches, debris, and something else. A coffin. It bobbed along the current like a black tooth. The villagers who saw it from the bridge refused to speak of it, but word reached the stone house before dusk. Clara's eyes lit with recognition. She had seen that coffin before. Nathaniel had built it himself, a mockery of burial, a vessel designed not for rest but for preservation. She ordered the sisters to retrieve it under cover of night. The coffin was heavier than stone. They dragged it into the root cellar, lanterns flickering, rats scattering before them. With careful hands, they pried open the warped lid. Inside lay not Nathaniel, but ash. Fine, gray, clinging to their fingers like smoke. But in the corner of the coffin, half buried in the soot, was an object, a brass locket engraved with the Harrow crest. When Clara opened it, she found a curl of blonde hair and a scrap of parchment, so decayed it nearly disintegrated in her hand. On it were words written in Nathaniel's unmistakable script. Bloodbound is never broken. Even ash remembers its maker. The sisters debated the meaning deep into the night. Was Nathaniel dead? Or had he reduced himself to something more elusive, scattering himself across earth, ash, and bone? Clara feared the latter. She recalled the nights when Nathaniel ranted about permanence. Stone crumbles, wood rots, but the essence remains, he would whisper, pacing the parlor with his hands blackened by ink. The trick is to bind essence to flesh, and flesh to memory. Then even death becomes an inconvenience. Perhaps the coffin was not an end, but a warning. That spring, their war spread beyond the county. In Albany, a banker who had once laundered Harrow money vanished from his townhouse. In Pittsburgh, a surgeon who had supplied bodies to the Harrow cellar failed to return from a house call. In each case, the only trace was a scrap of parchment pinned to the door with a straight pin. Sometimes it bore the letter G, other times simply a phrase, "The brides endure." Newspapers began to speculate. "The bride murders," one headline screamed. "A cult of women terrorizes the East." Ministers thundered from pulpits that wickedness was loose, that women untethered from male guidance were a danger to all civilization. But among the poor, among the forgotten, whispers spread differently. These were not monsters, they said. These were avengers. These were widows, taking back what had been stolen. Clara herself traveled now, leaving the stone house for weeks at a time. She moved like smoke, always ahead of questions, always behind the disappearances. She studied her enemies as Nathaniel had studied his brides, but she harvested their weakness instead of their blood. Yet beneath her resolve burned obsession. Every city she entered, she searched for her daughters. She asked in schoolhouses, listened in church pews, lingered near riverboats where freed families sometimes gathered. Always the same ache, close, but not yet. One night in Buffalo, Clara found herself drawn to the docks. A lantern swayed in the fog. A voice drifted across the water, lilting, high, familiar. A hymn. Her knees weakened. The song was one she had sung to her girls years before, when they were small enough to rest their heads on her lap. She followed the sound to a warehouse where women worked late into the night, sewing uniforms for soldiers. Among them was a woman with hair like hers, a woman who sang to keep rhythm with her needle. Clara's heart beat like thunder. She wanted to step forward, to speak her name, but fear chained her. What if the girl turned away? What if the woman she had become despised the mother who had left her? She slipped back into the fog. The hymn followed her for miles. Back at the stone house, unrest brewed. The sisters were changing faster. Their eyes reflected light like glass. Their skin grew paler, smoother, as if they were shedding the years Nathaniel had stolen. They whispered among themselves when Clara was absent. "Are we his still, or are we hers?" one asked. "Do we serve vengeance or survival?" another replied. Cracks widened in their unity. Clara sensed it but said nothing. To acknowledge it was to risk collapse. By the winter of 1923, the outside world pressed harder. Federal agents now investigated, their reports filled with language of contagion, hysteria, witchcraft. One congressman called for the stone house to be burned, marsh and all. Clara prepared for fire. She ordered tunnels reinforced, stockpiles gathered. But in her journal, she wrote a single truth. The world will burn before we do. On Christmas Eve, the river carried another coffin. This one was smaller, carved of cedar, bound in iron. The sisters hauled it ashore, hearts heavy. When they forced the lid open, they found not ash, but bones, delicate, child-sized. And nestled between them, a vial of dark liquid, sealed with wax. Clara recognized it at once. Nathaniel's elixir, the serum he had used to bind his brides to endurance, the serum that had birthed their strange survival. But why send it back now, bound with children's bones? A message, she decided. He was not gone. He was waiting. That night, the sisters stood by the river, the vial in Clara's palm. "Do we destroy it?" one asked. Clara stared at the black surface of the water. To destroy it was to end his grasp, but to keep it was to hold a weapon, and perhaps a cure. She corked the vial again, slipped it into her cloak. Not yet, she said. The river hissed at her feet, and in the silence that followed, every sister understood. Their war was far from over, for Nathaniel Harrow was not dust. He was ash, drifting, waiting for breath to stir him again. And the only question that mattered was this: would Clara find her daughters before he found her?